Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Request permission that the quorum call be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we are all watching the news this morning as a very, very threatening and ferocious hurricane is bearing down upon Florida, a storm that is causing great anxiety. Hopefully people are as prepared as they can be, but the consequences of these storms, these disasters that we are seeing, are ravaging in ways that are seemingly more ferocious than before. We saw that last week in Puerto Rico, and just about 10 days ago, we felt the effects of Typhoon Merbok on the western coast of Alaska. And I'd like to take just a few minutes here this afternoon, because as I was watching the news as this Hurricane Ian is approaching the coast of Florida, I can't help but think about what the folks back home are facing as they have lived through a very terrifying disaster like the typhoon, and then what happens next. Because unfortunately, and you know in your state very well with the fires that ravaged New Mexico, that disasters come through and the attention of the country is focused on that. And we all want to be there to be of help and of assistance. And we have FEMA, and we've got Red Cross, and we've got everybody that is there. And it's all very important and very well intended. But then the next disaster comes. And so maybe, I don't know, maybe the people in New Mexico are thinking that we've forgotten them. I don't want the people of Alaska to think that we have forgotten what happened in their communities. Typhoon Merbok came up from Japan, came across the Gulf up into the Bering Sea, and impacted an area of land on the coast of Alaska in excess of 1,000 miles. So to put it into context, it's as if the entire west coast of the United States, from the Canadian border all the way down to Mexico, were impacted and inundated by one massive storm. That's the size and the scope of what we experienced. Hurricane force winds, seas in the Bering Sea, waves as high as 50 feet. The impact to the land was extraordinary with the strength of the winds, but it was this massive storm surge that came. We get tough storms in the Bering Sea. We get really tough storms in the Gulf of Alaska. But what we saw this year was a storm that was earlier in its intensity than we have seen in previous years. Oftentimes people think about Alaska and think, man, it must be tough when the ice is formed out over the whole sea and everything is locked in. Actually, that's when we have safety. Because when there is ice that takes you all the way up to the shoreline, these massive storms with the wind, they can't build the waves to that level to eat away at the shore, to cause the destruction that we're seeing with again, the intensity of the impact of this storm. We in Alaska were lucky. There were no people that were killed or injured. Really astonishing, given all that the area sustained. I think part of that was just due to being prepared, knowing that everybody had to hunker down. But when your community then is literally separated in two, as they were in Hooper Bay, where on the old side of town, you're cut off from your evacuation center, which is the school, because the waters have risen to the point where it is no longer accessible. There is no way to get to safety and it's blowing 80 miles an hour in the middle of the night, the only place that you can go to is the next house up, hoping it's going to be a little bit higher above the water. And so it is a recognition that preparation is going to be key to save lives. But it's also making sure that our coastal communities that are so exposed, as the many in Western Alaska are, that they're able to push back or hold back to the extent possible some of the erosion, the threat that comes their way. We have seawalls that are nothing more than boulders that are built up, dunes and berms that have been built over the years. But again, recognizing how minimal that is in terms of a protective barrier when you have the extent and the intensity of these storms, this is where many Alaskans are feeling very exposed and very vulnerable, knowing we made it through this storm, but what happens with the next one? Because now that berm in Chaktulik is completely eroded away. The portion of the seawall, a good portion of the seawall in Nome, the rocks are just jumbled and scattered. What we saw in Elam around their front street there, they had a seawall of sorts. It was like a giant had come in and just picked up those boulders and sprinkled them, threw them all around. The front street there that had just been asphalted a couple years ago, the pieces of asphalt almost like lifted up, peeled back like a piece of taffy, just curled over the beach there. You look at that and you say, you cannot comprehend the strength of that storm surge, the strength of what had caused that to just buckle and heave and literally melt. I had a chance over this weekend to go and visit the area. I flew up to Nome, and we were able to go out to Golovin and Elam on the first day. Elam is a community of about 125 people, pretty small, but pretty important in terms of what they do. They're trying to build a little subsistence harbor there. Resilient people, but some of what we saw with the erosion and what that will mean to them and their community, what it's going to mean to them and their water supply. Golovin, a little bit bigger of a community, several hundred people. Golovin was impacted in a way and a manner that was just almost mind-boggling. The surge from the storm coming up over this isthmus there, literally lifting homes up off of their foundation, floating them and depositing them in different locations. We went down a couple different streets, and you come around and there's a house literally in the middle of the road, and people are moving their four-wheelers on either side of it because the house is in the middle of the road. Another one on another corner that had been floated across that was just kind of cattywampus. These homes will never be habitable again. Sand you look at it from the air, and it's lovely golden sand, not something that you would expect to see on the coast of Western Alaska. But this sand now has inundated the entire lower part of the community, and making it a thick, spongy, soft, interesting, but really very, very impractical in terms of how do we move this wet, soggy sand out of everything that has come into the community here. The areas underneath the homes in most of these Western communities are elevated on stilts. Not very high, but they're all elevated. And they're elevated because you do have instances of flooding. But the flooding was so high that it came up underneath the belly board of these homes, saturated the insulation underneath with water, but worse to the point, water that was mixed with the diesel that had come from people's home heating fuel, their stove oil, the fuel that they may have had for their snow machines or their four-wheelers. You could smell going into the homes the diesel that was below. So what everyone was doing was literally ripping the insulation out from underneath their homes and buckets full of, dozer loads full of wet, soggy, contaminated insulation being hauled off to the dump. So that's all the activity that's going on now. And it's fast and it's frenetic. And it needs to be. Because on the day that I was there in Golovin and Elam, and then 2 days later when I was in Hooper Bay and Chivak, the weather was kind of nice. It was decent. But in about 2 weeks, in about maybe 3 weeks, winter comes. Winter's on its way. And when winter comes, you can't move around. When the ice comes down out of the north, you don't have fuel barges that return to the area until the spring. That fuel barge maybe May in the upper river regions, June. So think about that. So if you've lost your fuel and the last fuel barge has come and gone, and you weren't filled up, it's a long wait. What do? If you can't barge it in, you fly it in. Imagine, Mr. President, what it means to fly in your fuel into these villages. Construction materials. How do we get the construction materials up there? Whether it's the sheetrock or the plywood or the insulation. Well, you put it on the barge. Well, the last barges are like the fuel trucks. Barges won't be back until the spring. So right now people are planning on, I need to fix up my home, but I'm not going to be able to get the materials until June. Well, what happens in the meantime? What happens in the meantime is winter comes. And so if you don't have any insulation under your home, if you haven't been able to get your home situated, you're going to be pretty vulnerable. You may have made it through the storm, but it may be a very, very, very difficult and cold winter. It may be that your family of 8 is now going to have to move in with another family that is already in an overcrowded situation. We don't have extra housing. There is no extra housing. So everybody is moving as quickly as they possibly can to try to bring relief. We've got the National Guard that are doing amazing things. Red Cross was out there analyzing. We were out there with the FEMA administrator, took her to Nome, was able to take her to Golovin. She was able to see the destruction that came to the fish camps right outside of Nome. Fish camps are not where people go for a holiday. Fish camp is where people work. This is where they harvest and they process and they prepare their food. Whether it's the salmon nets to catch the salmon, the beluga nets, the gear that they have for their fishing. If they're able to get caribou or moose, this is where they come and they process. They've harvested their berries. Everything kind of comes together at fish camp. And then you're ready for winter. But what happens when you've harvested and gathered and fished and you've put it all in your freezer, and then the power goes out, as it did, for multiple days, and you lose everything in your freezer. Power went out here in Washington, D.C. when I was back in Alaska in August, and I lost the stuff in my freezer. You know what? I'm just fine. I can go down to the grocery store here. Folks in Elam don't have that opportunity. The people in Golovin and Chivak and Hooper Bay and Chaktulik and all of the other places that have been impacted, the outdoors is their grocery store. And the outdoor grocery store is now shut down because salmon season is over. Fishing is pretty much over. Berries are gone. Moose and caribou. Maybe they'll be able to get a little bit of game, maybe not. And so think about what that means when your food source is now gone. You've lost your boat because that was swept away or demolished. You've lost your motor. This is not recreational boat. This is how you earn, this is how you feed your family. This is how you live. The four-wheelers, like just thrown up and crumbled and crushed. That's not recreation. That's how people move around. And so when you think about the ability then to what do you do now? What do you do now? So I'm sharing this with people because this is what has been keeping me up at night and getting me up really early in the morning to figure out what more we can do to help the people in these small communities that lived through a very scary natural disaster, but who have looming in front of them perhaps a very frightening winter, a cold winter, one where their food resource is gone, where the expense of living has always been high, but now we don't even know how to account for how high it is. I was talking with a guy in Chivak who said that he had ordered a little bit of lumber. He was working on something. He didn't even say what it was. He says it was like $1,500 worth of lumber, but it cost him $2,200 to get it there, to freight it up. I went into the grocery store, as I do in as many of the small towns and villages as I can, because I always price things like, okay, what's a box of Tide? I know what it is in Anchorage, I know what it is in Fairbanks, but in Chivak, it's $45 before the tax is added onto it. But I had heard this crazy story that bottled water was more expensive than fuel. And I think that can't possibly be. Fuel's $7 a gallon out there in Nome and probably a little bit more in Chivak. A 24-pack of bottled water, and I don't know what the label was. It was like generic bottled water that you could probably get at Costco. $91. That did include tax. $91. $91 for a bottle of water. And this is in a community where they were still on a boiled water notice because they were just still checking out their water systems. So we're working hard. Nobody's sitting back and waiting for the federal government to come in and help them because they don't have time. They're cleaning things up. The FEMA administrator saw Nome, and you know, in fairness, compared to where she was in Puerto Rico, it probably didn't look that bad. But when you peel it back, and when you look at the damage, and when you realize the vulnerability going forward into this winter, that's where it looks scary. So we're using every resource that we have, every volunteer, every agency, and people are there, and they're putting their muscle into it. We have asked for the same support that President Biden has given to Puerto Rico with a 100% cost share waiver for the first 30 days to get things cleaned up. I'm desperately hopeful that the administration hears us on that. Because for us right now, it's this immediacy of time to get things pulled back together as fully as we possibly can. Because they cannot be in a situation where in the middle of the winter, when resources may be there, but they're a long way away and they're very expensive, that we then realize that we have to provide additional support and additional relief. There is a resilience in Alaska and certainly a resilience in Western Alaska. These people have lived in these villages for thousands of years, maybe not in exactly the same place, but they're not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere. And what I feel compelled to do is everything in my power to make sure that they're not forgotten and that they and their families are able to move forward in these next months. With that, Mr. President, I just share that my thoughts and my prayers are not just limited to those in Alaska, but we think about all those who have suffered due to disasters, whether in New Mexico and Puerto Rico, or those who are very, very fearful in Florida right now. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and would suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call